Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, depending on which coast you're on. I'm Josh Macauer, professor of medicine and bioengineering here at Stanford, and the director and co-founder of Stanford Biodesign. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of Stanford Byers Center for Biodesign and the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy. I just want to welcome everybody to today's policy discussion, the need for transitional coverage for emerging technologies. Thank you for joining us today on this important topic. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. This is a public webinar, so it is being recorded and it will be available afterwards for viewing as well. If you have any questions for the panelists, use the Q&A function in Zoom, and our moderators will relay your questions to the panelists, and hopefully we'll get time for as many as possible. Next slide. Next slide. Stanford Byers Center for Biodesign's purpose is to advance health outcomes and equity through innovation, education, translation, and policy. That last word, policy, is new. This is a new purpose for us, and what we're going to be doing, in fact, we've already started, is really a new policy program here at Biodesign focused on innovation. Our primary purpose is to develop usable information that can be used by policymakers who are currently grappling with a variety of policy issues, as well as train the next generation of policy innovators. And we're going to do this through a couple of different venues. The first and most exciting is a completely new fellowship here at Biodesign. It's going to be a 2-year fellowship. We'll be accepting applications this summer for entry into the class that will begin August 2023. But this is a fellowship that will allow for learning about innovation. So you'll be entrenched in the innovative process, while at the same time participating in important policy research, which will work to publish and get into the public domain. The second year of the fellowship will be a fully paid opportunity to work in government. We hope to find positions in the White House, Congress, as congressional staffers, as well as CMS, FDA, and other government agencies working collaboratively there to establish roles for these up-and-coming policymakers. So that's the fellowship. The other important element is, of course, the research, and that is really what brings us together today around our first paper focused on transitional coverage for emerging technologies, formerly known as MCET and now TCET. You'll see these words interchanged. At the time the survey was run, MCET was the prevailing framework, and we used in the survey the words MCET-like, and so now CMS has identified TCET as the language that they like to use. So you'll see a mixture of these words today. We're really talking about a program to allow for early coverage, post-approval, to allow for evidence development, and really allow for a technology to not be sit on the sidelines and be waiting for all these things to come to line for years until they can get, patients can gain access, in this case, Medicare patients. The last most important piece also is to create these convening events where we can really bring different stakeholders, different points of view together to try to find a path forward and arrive at policy that works for everyone and advances innovation and improves outcomes for patients, reduces cost, and really improves the experience for patients and physicians. So one last slide, next slide. Here are our disclaimers and disclosures. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mark McClellan, who leads the Duke-Margolis Center for Policy that we're partnering with on this important webinar. And Mark, take it away.
Great, thanks very much, Josh. I'm Mark McCullough. I'm the director of the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy. You see on the next slide, we're an organization that many of you know of our work engaged in policy reforms in a range of areas involving improving health equity, and the value of health care. Much of that involves innovation, including biomedical innovation, which we're focusing on here today. And we appreciate the opportunity for this collaboration. This is our first collaboration with Stanford Biodesign and their efforts to bring industry perspectives into important policy reforms effectively. Next slide, just a couple of quick disclaimers. We are not going to be discussing any anti-competitive information here, so nothing proprietary. The goal here is to really move this whole important area of care transformation forward. I also want to use this opportunity to remind people about the Duke-Margolis independence policies related to a frank discussion of a range of perspectives of ideas. And my own personal disclosures: I'm an independent board member for Cigna, Johnson & Johnson, Alignment Healthcare, and Prognom IQ. Next slide highlights the importance of the, so you go on to the next slide. The importance of the topic that we're talking about today is on, to go on to the next one. Just want to emphasize the challenges that have been brought out, and you can hear about in Josh's survey from people in the industry about, on the one hand, some recent advancements in technology that have led to an influx of novel technologies, further advanced by FDA's breakthrough designation in the device space. Technologies have the potential to improve survival, improve quality of life, reverse course of illness. But while there's a lot that goes on to bring a technology to market, there's also a lot that's involved in the comprehensive process of getting to widespread, well understood, and predictable coverage and payment for those technologies. That includes the items on this slide. Coding, specific codes that replace temporary provisional codes can take time. Coverage, a main focus today. Initially, when products are approved, they can be billed on an individual claims basis, but occasionally, in some cases, don't have a straightforward path from there. Payment goes beyond coverage to whether new technology add-on payments are needed, whether technology fits into existing payment category. And then also an important source of uncertainty that I want to emphasize is evidence. Breakthrough devices are often approved with limited evidence on things like long-term outcomes, durability, safety issues in subsets of Medicare beneficiaries, which gets to issues around confidence. Can beneficiaries and their clinicians make informed decisions of confidently use a new device? So these are issues that go beyond coverage and payment and to things like appropriateness of value. And finally, would emphasize that Medicare today, it's our main focus of our discussion, now has almost half of beneficiaries in Medicare Advantage plans, and of those in traditional Medicare, a growing share, over 30%, approaching 40%, are in accountable care organizations and other arrangements, new kinds of payment models that are intended to provide more comprehensive care that focuses on getting the best combination of treatments for individual patients. So things matter there, like comparative effectiveness and other steps that will influence use of technology. So on to the next slide. And we're focusing on breakthrough devices. As of September 2020, about 16 devices with breakthrough designation had reached FDA approval. Now we're at over 20. Of note, not all of these face issues in the dimensions that I just described. Some of them do not have a Medicare benefit category, so they're not going to be covered. Some of them are not intended for the Medicare population. Some of them fit into an existing bundled payment system, so there's no separate coverage policy needed for elements within the bundle. Of these initial approved breakthrough technologies, only one has had a national coverage policy. But some have had issues around individual coverage across those local carriers. So the overarching point here is that there are some specific opportunities to undertake Medicare coverage assessments, maybe more predictably, maybe in a more timely way, to determine if a treatment is reasonable and necessary, not in all cases for breakthrough technologies, but in this subset where coverage is important. Beyond that, I want to emphasize again the importance of evidence to reach a reasonable and necessary decision. I think you'll hear about today. The FDA standard for safe and effective for overall approval is different than the Medicare standard for reasonable and necessary for appropriate use in Medicare beneficiaries. So we're going to come back to that in the next slide. Highlights that there have been proposals to address this before. Initially, Medicare coverage of innovative technology was proposed by CMS in 2020. There is a version of this in the 21st Century Cures proposed legislation. Very important topic as we're talking about today, but some concerns as well. Concerns about things like limited evidence at the time of approval, particularly on relevant Medicare beneficiaries that might use the technology. Also, other issues like the fact that in these emerging areas, there's not just a first breakthrough device, but there may be other products coming along that are improvements on that one or that follow on in some ways. And having a consistent coverage policy for those two, as well as addressing those evidence issues and safety issues, is also important. And that's why CMS has highlighted their support for a transitional coverage for emerging technologies process that's aiming to get some of the advantages and goals of the original MCIT proposal, but also addressing concerns like not having a clear path for developing needed additional post-market evidence and having predictability upfront for just what it's going to take to get coverage, as well as potentially help with some of these related issues for reliable payment and reimbursement. And so on to the next slide. For our meeting today, we're going to take stock of where we are and where we're headed. We're going to start with remarks from Lee Fleischer, CMO and Director of the Center for Clinical Standards and Quality at CMS, who is playing a lead role in this and many other important innovative technology issues. Then we'll go to a review of that survey by Stanford Biodesign of people in the biotech biomedical industry on their views about what coverage looks like and improvements that they'd like to see. Then we're going to have a more in-depth discussion about how to move forward on this potential path for transitional coverage, and then discuss some practical issues around implementing transitional coverage under these overall designs. So it's a packed couple of hours ahead. Really glad to have you here with us. I encourage that these people are doing this already. If you have questions or comments that you'd like to bring up for the group discussion, please use the Q&A tab. And with that, I'd like to go to the next slide and introduce Dr. Lee Fleischer. Lee, thanks so much for joining us today on this important and timely topic.
Thanks so much, Mark. And can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes, just fine.
Great. And are you guys going to advance my slides, or would you like me to?
We will, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to start here with, I'm sure everyone's now familiar with the CMS strategic pillars that, in effect, as you know, we have 6 pillars at CMS: advancing equity. I'm sure that will be discussed, expanding access, engaging partners. And that's really what we're spending time both here, and I'll talk about our future listening sessions, driving innovation, another key component here, but also protecting our programs and being good stewards of public funds, and as well as fostering excellence. So we really want to frame the entire discussion within those strategic pillars. So on the next slide, so our mission around promoting evidence-based care, and clearly evidence-based care is the hallmark of modern medical care and underpins the HHS, but also the CMS value mission. You can't deliver value if treatments don't work. And as a clinician and health services researcher, I know that if and how well they work may depend on the population treated, as well, and the settings where care is delivered. And in a value-based world, these decisions are usually made by people like myself, the clinicians, as well as the healthcare systems itself. And we believe at CMS that we're uniquely positioned to help set those evidence-based care standards because of our national scope and because of our close relationship with the FDA, NIH, ARC. And we're able to get the best available expert guidance, both in-house and from our partners on emerging therapies, even when the evidence is very limited. And for traditional fee-for-service Medicare, we recognize that national coverage decisions don't just establish that an item or service will or won't be paid for, they establish the context and circumstance in which they will be paid, which confers crucial beneficiary protections, but also ensures that high-value care. So on the next slide, so we have a number of coverage options for both routine and emerging technologies. We recognize that the Food Administration, Food and Drug Administration, as Mark talked about, is responsible for clearing devices, approving drugs, and licensing biologics based upon a determination that they're safe and effective. By contrast, CMS may extend coverage to an item or service if the Secretary determines that it is reasonable and necessary. I know we repeat those terms often, but it's under Section 1862A1A of the Social Security Act, and that really guides our decision process. These two standards are not synonymous. So when making coverage determinations, CMS policies have long considered whether the item or service is not just safe and effective, but also whether the item or service is not experimental or investigational, one of our criteria, and is appropriate for Medicare beneficiaries. The MAC manual lays out the elements of appropriate. Note that CMS relies on accepted standards of practice and considers the setting, provider qualifications, as well as beneficiary needs. While much of the public focus has been on national coverage decisions, it's important to recognize that most decisions actually occur at the local or MAC level, as defined here. So it's important to recognize that CMS completes about 3 to 4 NCDs annually on average. This follows a statutorily defined open and transparent process, including reviewing the evidence that generally requires about 9 months to complete. Given the resources involved in developing these, there is currently a wait list, and we recognize that. At the local level, there are approximately 37 unique LCDs performed annually, unique being that multiple MACs may address the same topic, and LCDs also take approximately 9 months to complete. Lastly, when there's no NCD or LCD, the MACs may cover the services through individual claim determination. Next slide. So what's the current state and what are the coverage challenges that we recognize with emerging technologies? And we recognize that national coverage determinations establish the conditions of coverage for these emerging and high impact technologies. And importantly, we recognize that anyone can ask to open an NCD, but as I noted, there is a wait list. As Mark defined, one of the key initial criteria is there a benefit category? And we need to identify one through the defined benefit program or a BCG. The second thing is coding. When submitting to a bill to CMS, providers must include the appropriate codes that may not be established at the time of the FDA market authorization. With respect to our coverage decisions, we need to define if there is evidence of benefit in the Medicare population as defined in the statute, and the strength of evidence for both benefits and harms. And when we think about this, and we'd like more comment, on this as we see comment is it a low-risk device, a high-risk device? And do we have adequate evidence to define risk, including those issues that I defined of patient, provider, and facility characteristics? Next slide. So how are we thinking about the future steps? And we really want to engage with all the stakeholders, why I'm here and the entire team's here today to listen in and help shape the future state of covering emerging technologies. We held a listening session on February 17th, 2022, and learned a lot from that, and that has informed some of the things I'll discuss today. Our next listening session is on March 31st, 2022. So we really hope you join us. And importantly, we want to hear comments about some of the ideas we're bringing today. That it's most important, as I said, one of those 6 pillars, that we hear from the stakeholders and you engage with us and give us ideas regarding many of the questions that we're asking of the community. So on the next slide, I identify some of our early considerations based upon those listening sessions and based upon the comments we received previously. So in light of the extensive public feedback, particularly around the repeal of MCIT regulation, we're considering a range of changes to the NCD process, and when required, the CED, or coverage with evidence development paradigm. As part of the pre-market and pre-coverage period, CMS is considering both an evidence preview pilot program and an environmental scan. Fundamentally, an evidence preview is built around a systematic literature review of published peer-reviewed literature. We developed the systematic literature review protocol in collaboration with the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and it applies standardized criteria to risk of bias assessment, evidence grading, and applicability or generalizability of the assessment. In the event that important evidence gaps are identified in the evidence preview, CMS is exploring whether manufacturers should submit a proposed evidence development approach once a national coverage analysis is open. This gets us into our consideration of potential coverage pathways. The evidence approach should address important evidence gaps, either through a conventional clinical study or potentially through a fit-for-purpose study design. With an approved evidence development plan, CMS could then plan an update to its literature review at a date linked to the plan. And as part of the evidence development approach, CMS is also exploring whether manufacturers should propose any needed beneficiary protections that optimize outcomes for those Medicare beneficiaries. For example, they might propose the setting and the context of optimal service delivery or the provider qualifications. Next slide. So I'd like to show you and walk through one pathway that is proposed around the feedback. And really we'll take additional feedback, but this is a good place to start. As you see in the pre-marketing period, we are exploring whether greater clarity of which study endpoints would be of great interest to CMS and would be helpful to the manufacturers. We are also considering, if required, whether CED study requirements require an update. We're also exploring and working toward closer collaboration with the FDA partners so that we have early feedback on product labeling and the likely timing of market authorization. We are also exploring how we can get better aligned CED requirements with post-marketing study requirements. In terms of manufacturer engagement, we have long provided extensive feedback on IDE studies. Based upon public feedback at the last stakeholder meeting, We are now exploring whether an evidence preview would be helpful prior to FDA market authorization, and whether it would be helpful for manufacturers to propose a specific evidence development approach if evidence gaps are identified. While all national coverage analyses require an open and transparent process, the evidence preview allows CMS to determine if there are gaps in the evidence, what those gaps are, and can inform discussions about potential coverage options. The MCIT pathway covered specific breakthrough devices, but a paradigm which might include CED would cover a class of devices and could allow for off-label coverage within an approved study. Next slide, please. So what about a potential future state? And this is one potential map that we're thinking about. And again, we welcome your comments either today or importantly on our stakeholder call. And this schematic really illustrates how these components could work together. A manufacturer could engage CMS, preferably prior to FDA market authorization, to request a review. If appropriate, CMS could then initiate an evidence review that informs a CMS-sponsored meeting about the state of the evidence and the potential evidence gaps. Based upon that conversation, the manufacturer would then have a better sense of their coverage options. If the evidence is robust, the next step may be to make a formal NCD request. If the evidence is promising, but important gaps remain, the manufacturer may choose to request an NCD with the understanding that they will need to propose an evidence development approach soon after the NCD analysis is open. And lastly, if the manufacturer chooses not to open an NCD, they will remain at MAC discretion, which could result either in LCD or LCDs or the individual claim determinations. So we truly are seeking your input on such a paradigm based upon what we've heard. So next slide. I just want to thank you for listening today. We look forward to the robust discussions to help us come up with a paradigm to ensure our beneficiaries get access to high value emerging technologies. Thank you.
Lee, thanks very much for your time, your team's time on thinking through these issues, engaging with the public on them. Obviously, really important. Wondering if I could go back to this. You described the upcoming listening session. That seems very important. Now that you're getting some quite substantive feedback and laying out a path forward. Also seeing that action in this area on transitional coverage for emerging technologies is on the OMB calendar, meaning something that CMS intends to get to with the government regulatory clearance process in the months ahead. Is there anything more you can say about the timing of the steps from here? I mean, I think we get that this is a timely and priority issue for the agency, but I know there's some questions about that.
Yeah, I did speak to our deputy administrator today, and we are committed. As you know the regulatory process very well, Mark, but our goal is to get something out by the end of the year.
Great, thank you. And so that feedback that you're looking for, just for everybody who's joining us today, sooner rather than later, because these processes do take a little bit of time. You talked about a number of areas in your slides where CMS is looking for further feedback and comments. I don't want to repeat those, but you know, Lee, one of the issues that comes up a lot across these different dimensions of creating a new and more predictable pathway and addressing some of the challenges like evidence gaps on the one hand and the importance of timely and predictable access and coverage and payment on the other is, you know, how do you balance these? So timely access, sufficient evidence to assure safety and give beneficiaries and clinicians a basis for making confident decisions. That's really important for technology adoption too. Any further thoughts you can add about how you're approaching this issue, or is this just the kind of thing that you'd like to get more feedback on at this point?
A little both. I mean, clearly we want more feedback. One of the key questions, as someone who came from prior to entering government service, thinking about these from the researcher side is, what kind of evidence is developed? And that's why we want to engage earlier. Is there a population in whom there's clear benefit to the Medicare population? And the other is what type of risk, both the device and being an anesthesiologist, Mark, you'll understand, I always think of if it needs to be inserted in the human body, the risk of that insertion, both anesthesia and surgical risk. So I think really that intersection of how much benefit that the technology companies can develop ahead of time as far as evidence of benefit, as well as what is that risk? Is it some high-risk procedure that's going to be done in the cardiovascular rooms when I give anesthesia on those Fridays, or is it a much lower risk technology, and therefore that may change the equation as we go as we think about it.
And say like permanent implant that may be harder to remove, et cetera.
Right.
So thanks for that framing. And
if it needs a craniotomy, that's part of the risk for the insertion.
And there are, I know we need to move on, but there are several questions related to the point that you made about there being a bit of a backlog right now for national coverage decisions, even though they're only 3 or 4 per year, even though that doesn't affect most of the technologies that go on to coverage and payment, including breakthrough technologies. Is how big is that backlog? And I think this gets at a concern that people have about, and that we're going to talk about the resources available to CMS to manage these issues effectively.
There's 2 things going on simultaneously. There's more new technologies as well as there's more evidence to review. So I know the current administration is committed to getting us some more resources. The other question is whether the LCD process at the MAC level, I know in my field, they work together around a joint LCD could also be used. But I know there's a commitment to try to reduce that backlog, because if we don't get those resources, Mark, as you say, it can only grow given the 2 things that are happening simultaneously, both the evidence and technologies. So that's I know the administrator is committed.
Great, thank you. I know we could go on, but Josh, let me turn to you.
Yeah, maybe I'll just ask one more question, then we'll hand it off to Sandy. I think it's clear from the research and also from our experience as well through the innovators that we are in touch with, that the existing coverage with evidence development and parallel review pathways have challenges. One of the most significant ones is the need that be linked to a national coverage decision. As you'll hear with some of the data that we have surveyed innovators, I'm curious as to whether you can envision as we think about TCET into the future, a different framework that does not tie the 2 together, or establishes clearly in the same way that FDA navigates with a applicant, a specific set of criteria that need to be successfully accomplished, let's say in a pivotal trial, whether the same could be established in that early framework to allow for clear transparency on what would essentially be the expected study post-market that would generate long-term approval. Do you think that that's sort of in the offing, or can we disassociate TCET from a national coverage decision pathway? There are certain regulatory obligations that really are critical. So I think that's the key question. The other question, we want to make sure that those studies are done. There's variable, as you know, and there was a recent paper on this, there's variability in how frequently those studies are actually completed. But the one thing that we are committed to, and I am committed to, is what does the coverage with evidence development, if that's the pathway that some of these products need to go through, how is it aligned with the FDA, but also post-marketing, as I mentioned,
but also how do we get to real world evidence or other forms of analysis that really don't have not necessarily requiring registries, which is the traditional way we've gone. So that's one of the other questions. I know, Mark, we have frequently talked to you about real world evidence and how can we get to that. So I know Duke-Margolis is committed to that.
Right.
That's right. I think we're going to come back to some of these issues in the discussion. Just would emphasize to people that national coverage decisions, that's a statutorily defined process that Lee, I know CMS and the teams involved in this are trying to find a way to address the underlying issues around gaps in evidence more efficiently. You saw Lee's chart showing in only a minority of cases where there may be these evidence questions. How can we anticipate those more effectively? How can we have an infrastructure in place, maybe alternatives or supplements or registries and so forth that could avoid delays, burdens, while still meeting those evidence needs? And so that's what we're going to turn to, I think, in more discussion now, since, as Lee said, this is a work in process.
Yeah, and Mark, I think the key thing being early engagement with Tamara and the coverage team, coverage analysis group, because I think that would ensure that the evidence that we need may be there upon approval. Would be the ideal situation.
Great. Well, with that, thank you very much, Dr. Fleischer. That was an excellent presentation, and we look forward to more engagement here. Let me turn it over to Dr. Sandra Ruggles, who is our Director of Policy Research at Stanford Biodesign's Innovation Policy Research Program. And she'll present the survey results from a published work that we just put out several months ago on this topic. Sandy, you want to take it over?
Sure. Great. Thanks, everybody. Why don't you go ahead and advance the slide? All right, I'm pleased to present our data today on behalf of myself and my co-authors, Juliana Pearl, Zach Sexton, Kevin Schulman, and Josh Macauer. So let's go to the next slide and start with just a little bit of background. So as we heard in earlier parts of the webinar and setting the stage, the proposal for accelerated coverage for novel technology has been around since approximately 2020, but the challenges associated with coding, coverage, and payment within the innovation ecosystem is something that we hear about at Stanford through our connections with founders, students, and innovators who are trying to bring forward these types of novel technologies. In particular, we hear and see projects get derailed at the earliest stages when the most significant risk is a reimbursement risk, because that is such a late stage risk for a project. And in fact, we commonly hear about this struggle to move from authorization by FDA to adequate and sufficient reimbursement as being called the valley of death amongst the startup ecosystem, because of the challenges with both generating sufficient and appropriate data and evidence to achieve each of those milestones, as well as the challenges on the opposite side of fundraising and sustaining companies through this period of time. So if you go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the scope of this study. The intent of this study was to put some quantitative metrics around what we hear anecdotally about the impact of reimbursement processes, as well as that impact on patient access to novel technology. We also wanted to more specifically get the responses from the innovation ecosystem to the proposals that had been established under the MCIT and MCIT nomenclature. So as Josh referred to, I'll talk about MCIT and MCIT-like throughout this presentation, because that was the prevailing terminology for this program at the time that we ran the study. So let me tell you more about the study. That's on the next slide. So we wanted to survey the innovation ecosystem. We used our mailing list from Stanford Biodesign, and then boosted that mailing out through additional partners, NVCA, AdvaMed, and MDMA, to ensure that we had a really broad spectrum of respondents from across industry who could provide feedback around what reimbursement processes were like today. We screened those respondents to ensure that they were knowledgeable around reimbursement timelines and around the processes associated with getting through coding, coverage, and payment milestones, and ended with a cohort of 336 responses. Keep in mind, these are people, not products, not companies, but people with experiences in this space, sometimes across multiple products. And then within those respondents, we selected them into two different pathways. 253 were innovators and were asked questions about the products that they had brought forward. And 83 were healthcare investors who were asked more about investment decisions and about the funding of such types of novel technology. Just a note about this whole thing. So we used a Qualtrics system that was based at Stanford. These were anonymous responses, and we did all of the analysis, data analysis in-house with our in-house research team. All right, so please go to the next slide. Let me tell you a little bit about the people who responded to the survey. As you can see, the majority of people who responded were either in executive leadership or reimbursement roles within the companies that they were part of, and primarily from companies that had fewer than 50 employees. The majority of the respondents were coming from companies with less than 500 employees. Last up, you can see the respondents to the survey. The majority of them had over 10 years of experience in healthcare and experience in an average of 3.1 clinical areas. So we felt like we were really tapping into those innovators who are pushing forward new and novel technologies. On the investor side, investors had an average of $1.4 billion dedicated to healthcare investing. The majority of those were investing from funds between $100 million and $500 million in size. We also got investors from across the landscape of health tech investing, from those who put just a tiny fraction of their investment funds towards medtech and diagnostic devices, to those who exclusively invested in this space. 41% of the investors invest the majority of their funds in companies developing medtech and diagnostic devices. So next slide. So with all that background, what did we ask everybody? First up, we wanted to understand these average timelines to reimbursement milestones. So we recognize there's lots of different devices and products that fall under the heading of medical devices and diagnostics. So you'll see that there's a lot of variability in this process. In this graph, though, you'll see that coding on average is taking 2.6 years. Medicare payment, first Medicare payment up to 3.3 years. The local MAC coverage decisions, 3.5 years, and national Medicare coverage, 4.7 years. And clearly there's quite a bit of variability in these processes. Sometimes it can be rather rapid. Other times it can extend up to almost 8 years to get sufficient coverage on a national basis. And I will clarify here that national Medicare coverage was used as a way to describe either a path that used a national coverage decision or a path that accumulated local decisions to reach a national coverage through those individual MAC decisions. But we want to emphasize the fact that these are timelines post-authorization and the high variability that innovators are experiencing in this space. If you go to the next slide, I also want to point out some of the things that we were hearing from investors. So we asked investors about the risk, the external risk factors associated with their investment decisions in medtech and diagnostic devices. And we see here reimbursement has that, and the reimbursement pathway, uncertainties in the reimbursement pathway are the dominant risk of all of the external factors around their decision to invest. So you can go to the next slide. Both arms of the survey were asked about whether existing processes provide timely patient access to novel medical technologies. And you can see that there's a very strong response from both innovators and investors that the current existing processes are not providing that access. There's a 67% disagree that these are sufficient. All right, can we go to the next slide? One of the things in the paper that we didn't get a chance to call out were some of the open-ended questions, open-ended responses, excuse me, that had been provided by our respondents. And I wanted to give you some visibility into the kinds of things people were talking about when we asked them about that timeline to reimbursement. And you can see evident frustration with the post-authorization pathways. Single words like challenging, highly variable, too long, were repeated in many different places. But I wanted to pull out some particular quotes that I think are illustrative of the challenges and the frustration that innovators are feeling. Particularly the idea that the evidence that is collected for FDA doesn't necessarily move forward into reimbursement decisions, and the fact that these long and extended pathways tend to incentivize the innovation ecosystem to move towards sure things rather than novel or breakthrough technologies that could really transform care. So you go to the next slide. I also wanted to show some of the responses that are maybe more focused around the MCIT program itself, around the idea that there's a certain amount of interest in FDA and CMS aligning on what evidence would be required, and particularly bringing some clarity during that process of FDA authorization. And in particular, finding ways to provide meaningful advice or feedback around what their decisions will be based upon and what evidence they need in order to make those decisions. Clearly, there's a feeling that while there are statutory requirements around how the process should happen, that there is a desire for a better understanding of what types of evidence would be necessary. Oh, you can go to the next slide. Turning now to some of the feedback around the MCIT program, we did ask respondents, innovators, whether they were collecting post-authorization clinical evidence. And you can see that over 80% of respondents worked at companies where real-world evidence collection, post-authorization clinical evidence was common, either always or most of the time collected on a novel technology. Bear in mind that sometimes this is required as part of the FDA process, but I think this shows that the ecosystem is clearly engaged in a substantial amount of clinical evidence collection, and there's an opportunity for CMS to engage around what type of evidence is being collected. If you go to the next slide. This is my last slide. The MCIT program does look like it would stimulate innovators to take on breakthrough product development. There was a strong response across all of the respondents about their likelihood to take on novel or breakthrough products if there was an MCIT-like program in existence. And as you can see, these are in areas that are of particular importance for Medicare beneficiaries. So if you go to the last slide, I'll summarize there. So we learned through this survey that current reimbursement processes are taking up to an average of 4.7 years. This is according to our survey respondents. They're finding that it takes an average of 4.7 years to get to nationwide coding, coverage, and payment decisions. And the innovators are frustrated with these current pathways and feel that these current regulatory pathways are not sufficient for patient access to new technology. It's common to collect post-authorization clinical evidence, and an MCIT-like program would stimulate innovator interest in breakthrough products. So with that, I'll wrap up there, and thank you so much for your time and attention. And we'll try to address some questions if we have a little bit of time here.
Great, thanks very much. And I'm getting a message I can't start my video. So if we could fix that. In the meantime, I'm gonna go ahead. I'm getting okay, great, thank you. So thanks, Sandra. Great to hear that thorough view of the perspectives from industry leaders and industry investors on the need for a transitional coverage program. Now, we talked earlier about some of the original MCIT goals and some of the issues that have come up since then as this process has evolved. We're going to start this session by going deeper into what some of those additional concerns are and building on the comments from Lee Fleischer and others about how to try to take those into account while doing so as efficiently as possible. So putting all this together, as you heard from Lee, now is the time to give some input from CMS about how to move this process forward. So on the next slide, as mentioned in November of last year, the proposed MCIT pathway was repealed because of a number of concerns. One set of them related to beneficiary safety. If the evidence for approval didn't have enough detail on issues related to Medicare beneficiaries, that coverage would be automatic, or there wouldn't be a quick way to change it, that could raise some concerns. And CMS reiterated that devices that are safe and effective by FDA standards are not necessarily safe for Medicare populations, maybe older, and may have other comorbid conditions. And again, it's not just safety and effectiveness, but appropriateness for use in the Medicare population that matters. And clearly, as you heard from the survey, there's some opportunities for improving our ability to understand what those distinctions mean and how to address them in both the pre and the post-market settings. And that's why CMS is doing these transitional coverage for emergency technology listening sessions and development process. So on to the next slide. There are a number of themes that have come out from surveys like the ones that you just heard. Surveys, for example, Rita Redberg published one recently that involved perspectives from technology experts, clinical experts that raised some of the concerns listed here that the process going forward will hopefully address effectively. One of those is clearly the need for more timely and predictable coverage, along with coding and payment, the whole package, for certain breakthrough devices. Again, they're not Medicare coverage issues at all with many devices. Some have a clear pathway into an existing payment system. Some get coverage reliably enough through local coverage decisions. So we're talking about an important subsegment of that total here. Then for many of these, there are these questions about relevant evidence of safety for Medicare beneficiaries. And if there are other key evidence gaps, certainly a need for clearer guidance from CMS to manufacturers. And we heard from Lee about ways in which that might take place through opportunities for early engagement. I appreciate, by the way, all the chat comments suggesting potential benefits of engagement with CMS while the pivotal trials are still being designed, and in certain cases that might fall into this category. And also clearer guidance about a path towards long-term coverage determinations. Remember, whatever coverage happens initially in this transitional phase, closer to initial approval and perhaps more national, would, with subsequent evidence, potentially turn into a permanent national coverage decision where you'd want to turn off whatever coverage with evidence requirements there are. You want to have a good plan in place ahead to know just what evidence needs to be developed and when it's going to be sufficient to move on to a more permanent coverage approach. And then assistance with CMS on leveraging these improvements in the coverage process to help address coding and payment issues if those are not clear either. So given all that, what does TCET potentially look like? You could look at the next slide on this. So some potential steps forward for addressing limited evidence, early manufacturer engagement, as we've talked about, opportunities for CMS to modify or rescind a coverage decision made under this transitional process as more evidence emerges, the challenge around adequate supporting evidence on benefits for Medicare beneficiaries. Once again, that early engagement approach with stakeholders, including, as somebody suggested in the Q&A, health systems or people who might be involved in developing this evidence or have important questions about using or adopting these technologies could be important there. Concerns that existing post-market requirements from FDA have led to incomplete or delays in data collection. Well, here too, earlier planning and engagement to get a more reliable infrastructure in place to give everyone more confidence about collecting needed data, conducting needed evidence development efficiently could help. Inconsistent coverage for market entrants that come in this same class or type of products after the initial breakthrough designation, even if those products might be better in some ways, less costly, or otherwise have advantages, maybe extending this the original MCIT type of approach to transitional coverage to other relevant products in the class predictably, and unclear path to minimizing gaps in access to coverage and payment. Again, it's not just about encoding and payment. It's not just about the coverage. CMS does have other offices that help with this. Some of it occurs through AMA and other processes outside of CMS, but maybe opportunities to develop to address those issues as well. And next slide. Building on a kind of a complement to what Lee described, the idea would be to have some laid out expedited pathway well prior to FDA approval, some kind of preliminary assessment of the evidence in cases where there is a question that maybe a manufacturer could initiate, and some early engagement for guidance from involving FDA sponsors and other stakeholders as relevant, so that when you get to the approval for the product that would be under this transitional coverage for emergency technology program, there would be a clear pathway forward in terms of what evidence is needed and what coverage and related issues would be undertaken to make sure that it all happens as smoothly as possible. I think many commenters have suggested, stakeholders suggested they want a public input process for this to occur. And then that's all intended to enable a plan for the timely analysis and completion of post-market evidence and a clear pathway to long-term permanent coverage. And again, this is not a pathway that's needed for all or even most breakthrough devices. There need to be some clarity, like some of your comments have suggested, on when the evidence questions are large enough, the safety or benefit questions are large enough that something like this is needed, when there's not going to be a straightforward path through in any event. And then just to the next slide, something we want to emphasize before I open this up for discussion is that this likely is going to mean additional resources for CMS. I had the privilege of both being FDA commissioner and CMS administrator. I would say that since I was at FDA, there's been a huge bipartisan investment in developing expedited pathways and expectations for communication, transparency, avoiding uncertainty around them, and a corresponding huge increase in the resources available to FDA through user fees, through Cures 1.0, and other legislation to enable that to take place. During that same period of time, the amount of resources available to the coverage and analysis group at CMS has gone down significantly, even as the amount of evidence and the diversity of products that CMS needs to deal with has expanded a lot. So considerations about at least incremental expansions of resources, which might be modest because we're talking again of only a limited set of breakthrough technologies where these issues are relevant, seems like a potentially worthwhile area for further discussion as part of this effort too. So with that, I'd like to open this discussion up to our panelists. I've gone to the next slide. So you've already met Josh Mackauer, who'll be one of our commenters. We're also pleased to be joined by Dirksen Lehman. He's Corporate Vice President for Public Affairs at Edwards Life Sciences. He's been very much involved in these innovative technology development, evidence development, and payment activities. Parashar Patel, also very much involved in some innovative proposals in this space. He's working as ViewRay's Senior Vice President for Government Affairs and Market Access, and has a long history on both the payer side and the innovator side and the public policy side in this field. And my old friend, Kevin Schulman. Kevin's Professor of Medicine, Associate Chair of Business Development and Strategy at Stanford. Previously was Director of the Health Sector Management Program at Duke University. So Dirksen, let me turn to you first.
Thanks, Mark. And first of all, thanks for having me. And thank you for holding this. Thank you to you and Josh for doing this. It's really, really important. And Josh, thanks especially to your tech team. My apologies. I had a really tough time this morning. I'm not quite sure why, but I joined quite a bit late. So my apologies if I've gone over a couple of things already that I missed. I also want to thank CMS and Dr. Fleischer for engaging in an earnest way over a long period of time. I know this is such an important discussion, and you heard him talk about his commitment, and we've seen that from him and from everybody that works with him. So thanks for making sure that we do this. I'm going to be relatively quick. I know we're a little bit behind on time. I want to talk a little bit about, the conversation started and the question was presented to me, what's the big company's perspective on TCET and coverage for emerging technologies? And I don't think we look at it that way. At Edwards, we think about we think about patients benefiting from a really, really healthy innovation ecosystem. And I think that's the evidence that Sandy presented is, hey, if you really want this ecosystem to be healthy, if you really want to get across the valley of death, this is really what we're talking about, some of the principles that we're talking about. So from a principle standpoint, we think about it in a pretty simple way. We think that it would really benefit patients, and we can get these innovations faster if there is a predictable and clear process that that innovators understand, and therefore investors can understand that predictability, that clarity, and that transparency is about the process. Of course, there are no assurances, but that's what that process is about. Of course, it needs to be voluntary. We firmly believe in that. But the next one is really big, and that is that we agree that evidence is a really, really important part of this. And if you're going to enter into this voluntary conversation, and if you get into a voluntary agreement on coverage for emerging technologies, that it is appropriate to have an evidence agreement, and that we look to the best ways that we can collect that evidence. And by that, I mean fit for purpose evidence, that we understand that there is not a one size fits all evidence plan. And so early engagement with CMS, I agree completely, really, really important. That early engagement, understanding where the evidence is, understanding where the evidence needs to go, and getting creative about how we collect and apply that evidence. And then, of course, we completely and firmly believe that you have to have beneficiary protections. Extremely important part here. If you find a safety signal, absolutely, it's fair to say this agreement no longer applies. So those are some of the fundamental things. We certainly would hope that would mean that there is a path to permanent coverage once you emerge from all of that. But those are the principles that we think about, and if we can, and I know we're hearing themes here of some of the things that have been outlined by Dr. Fleischer, not outlined by you, Mark, as well. But with that, just those are some top line comments about where we're coming from Edwards. Sandy, thanks for your presentation. Really, really good. I was noting that one of your comments at the bottom was that innovators that they absolutely believe that this would stimulate innovators to take on breakthrough product development. And this is really what we're talking about, is breakthroughs for patients of the future. So thanks for doing the good work.
Great. Thanks very much, Dirksen. And next I'll turn back to Josh.
Great, thank you. Next slide. Just to share some of the disclosures I'm associated with and consultant to a number, and on the board of and founder of a number of companies. Those are my disclosures. Next slide. I think the way I'd like to frame this for all participants, I want to thank the hundreds of people that are participating on the call. I know many stakeholders are here, and also Dr. Fleischer for your engagement, CMS's engagement. We have a big opportunity. We also have a big problem right now. Today, very important technologies that could benefit patients are languishing after approval, after safety and effectiveness has been proven through a pivotal study with the FDA. Many years can pass while innovators try to advance their innovations towards patients, and patients are waiting. And it's my belief, and we will work in further study. In fact, one of our current plans for further research is really to study this. But my belief is that this actually doesn't benefit anyone. It actually doesn't save costs to create delays in access. The opportunity provided by something like TCET is to actually get those technologies into the hands of doctors and patients and robustly study their performance in a real world environment beyond just the safety and efficacy study in the pivotal trial. So, this is an issue that is industry-wide. It's not just for Medicare patients. My hope is that a well-designed TCET program is a model for all public and private insurance going forward, because such a model, which would provide transparency and predictability of the milestones that must be hit in real-world evidence to solidify permanent payment and coverage, is a really important goal. The other thing that's important to mention is that today investors are highly discouraged and moving away from investments in medical technologies and new procedures. That's troubling for all of us who need these technologies for ourselves and for our children and for our parents. These are important technologies that have gone through rigorous testing with the FDA and now face daunting challenges once they're out post-approval, to then get to some level of access for all patients. So it's a systemic issue, much broader than CMS, but we have a unique opportunity with this program to really pioneer something incredibly innovative and test it out and see if it works, and absolutely could change the face of innovation for medical technology. Next slide. In terms of the frameworks that I'd like to propose into the debate here, is this program should be voluntary. And once established, would provide predictability before one goes into a pivotal study. The idea being that the innovator and CMS would have an opportunity to negotiate a clear real-world evidence trial, perhaps prior to engaging even with FDA, and try to integrate some of those ideas into the pivotal trial. As we all know, it's often difficult to accomplish both objectives, unfortunately. FDA's requirements for safety and efficacy don't always allow for the best trial to study cost effectiveness and other things that might be interesting in a real world environment, but really aren't available in a traditional FDA pathway. It's just the way it goes. It's not a failure of the system. It's just the fact that the real focus of FDA is safety and effectiveness. So we should have some degree of comfort, however, that after a pivotal trial has been accomplished, there is a reasonable assurance of safety and efficacy. So now the goal should really turn to, how does this perform in a real world environment? Can we create has this technology really a chance to address the quadruple goal of, improving outcomes and reducing costs, et cetera. And that can be studied best in an environment that allows for physicians to be paid, for the device to be covered and paid for. And those are all needed elements of being able to advance something in the real world after approval. So if there is a way for the most innovative and the most impactful, we could call it breakthrough, we could call it significant advancements in medical technology or patient care, however we want to define it. If there's an opportunity for these most innovative projects that don't have existing coding, coverage, and payment to get earlier access to those patients and allow us to study that data, could be hugely impactful. And I agree with Mark's statements. There needs to be a pathway to remove technologies that don't perform as expected or have challenges. And of course, this needs to be resourced. And that might require legislative change to allow for those resources to be available to CMS. This is going to be a big program. It'll have a lot of interest, and that's a good thing for all of us to be able to resource this properly and also make the program available to all the technologies and innovators that need it. So with that, I'll pause and I look forward to the other commenters' comments.
Great. Thanks very much. I'd like to turn to Parashar next.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Josh, for inviting me here today for this opportunity to participate and contribute to the discussion. It is very interesting, and I've got a real passion and personal stake in this because I actually took a technology through the NCD process when I was with Boston Scientific, Watchman technology, and some of the lessons I drew from that experience, as well as, frankly, from my time at CMS, is what's driving me a little bit to try to see if we can contribute and actually make this happen, because I think it's really important to shorten the gap between FDA approval and the time beneficiaries can actually access technology. And my guiding light at the time, Dirksen, was TAVR. TAVR is a great example back in 2011, 2012. It can be done. The time from FDA approval to the effective date of the NCD was, I think, 5 months, right? So it doesn't have to be as long as some of the timelines, Josh, that you guys found in your survey as well. Next slide. So I'm just going to provide a very high-level overview of some ideas and concepts that a group of us have informally been working on since probably last fall. You can see the companies up here. Many of the participants of our conversations are actually ex-CMS staffers, so we've got the benefit of folks that understand the CMS processes, know some of the constraints and some of the challenges CMS faces. When I was at CMS, I typically refer to the laws of physics. It's hard to change this ship on a dime for all good reasons I'll get into in a minute. But I'd like to thank everybody in the group that we've been talking about. Whatever I say here in response to questions are just my own comments. Next slide. So at a high level, as I said earlier, we want to make sure there's an expeditious, predictable process. I think those terms have been used in different ways, both by Mark, Josh, and other panelists, and even Dr. Fleischer talked about the need to improve the process. Those are the shared goals of the 5 companies that I displayed earlier. What we've developed next, I'll just cover at a very high level, is a conceptual framework that we believe in. Mark, I think you stole our slides about the CMS concerns. We had a checklist when we started this process, and we tried to tick off all of those boxes. And we think we've done a reasonable job, but again, this is just these are just ideas and suggestions we've pulled together. Early engagement, we've talked about that. It's really critical to make sure that those conversations can start early, because frankly, what the evidence gaps are, what the evidence generation requirements will be, those will take time for CMS to discuss with the stakeholders, for the stakeholders, for the manufacturer to think about it, et cetera, especially if we want to narrow that gap, because you'll see in a minute, there are lots of systems changes that need to take place. So we need time to make sure everything's planned out. That evidence generation plan has to be aligned, right? MCIT didn't quite have that type of requirement. We believe we need to align with what CMS's expectations are. Beneficiary protections, don't need to say any more about that. Very critical. Everybody's talked about that. We believe that there needs to be an opportunity for public comment. almost like help build case law, both for CMS to understand, and explain and communicate why they're expecting certain evidence generation for certain clinical areas, and for other stakeholders to really start understanding, if they're in that clinical space, what would be expected of them if they come through with a similar technology. And then I'll talk about the system readiness in a minute, and then our concept also addresses the concept of follow-on devices. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm not going to go into all of the detail here, but the whole point that we try to do is really, in essence, try to take each of the stages, and I think, again, we've talked about these stages in previous slides, but take each of the stages and drill down a little bit to really try to operationalize what this framework could look like. I know during the MCIT discussions back and forth, CMS had expressed a desire and basically indicated that there were some operational challenges with implementing MCIT. And so what we've tried to do is actually at each of the major stages, all the way from FDA, and we call it authorization process, but it's really that time frame for a 510K device, PMA, when they're going to the FDA about getting clearance or approval. At that time, again, specific to different technologies, different clinical spaces, at some point the manufacturer would go talk to Medicare, start that conversation about what is the gap from the manufacturer's perspective, from CMS's perspective, and how do we align on that evidence generation plan. Starting that early, we really believe allows CMS to start the formal regulatory process, if you will, of a coverage process upon FDA authorization, right? So as soon as the FDA authorizes it, CMS would publish a required notice, provide a comment period for stakeholders to comment. CMS takes those comments into consideration and posts a final decision. Again, the dates here are just for, I'm a relatively simple person. I like to have hard facts, and it helped guide the discussion of the timelines we're talking about. But during this time frame, there's a system readiness period, as we call it. And that system readiness period applies not only for Medicare to get their payment systems, their coding systems, or programming changes that are necessary that they do each quarter into the claims processing system, but it also allows manufacturers, to the extent that there's evidence generation plans that require contracts and signatures with providers, et cetera, get those into place, right? This, again, all of this doesn't happen on a dime. So the system readiness period really is a notion for both CMS, providers, and manufacturers to get ready for evidence generation. Again, fit for purpose. We're not dictating any particular study design or evidence generation framework. Once that's set in place, transitional coverage would start. We've talked about a period of about 4 years. From our perspective, that would allow sufficient time for relatively, relatively long processes, but also acknowledges the fact that if you're going to rely on non-clinical data for some of this, there are some systems challenges there of getting the data, analyzing it, et cetera. And so again, fit for purpose, go for 4 years, and then decision point, whether you go to NCD process, whether you go MAC for permanent coverage, et cetera. So at a high level, that's the type of framework that we were envisioning. I think one thing that I found interesting in what Dr. Fleischer presented was, I think he had a little box about evidence generation and then going into NCD. And again, I think those are the kinds of discussions that we should all have, because certainly we don't necessarily want to have a process where it's a two-step process. If in fact we can get to a one-step process where you collect the evidence generation, you analyze it, and that becomes the permanent state of coverage, I think that we would welcome that as well. So let me stop here and turn it back to you, Mark.
Great. Thanks very much for that presentation. Lots to come back to if we have time. We're going to try and keep this moving. Kevin, over to you next.
Well, thanks, Mark. Great to see you again. And my remarks are really going to be a little bit about the economics. Why, it doesn't sound like a big deal to have a little bit of extra time for CMS to go through this process, but really put the business school hat on. What happens to investment thesis as a result of that? Next slide. So, here's a really simple idea of what this looks like. You know, there's some time period we're making investments, we're doing clinical trials, we're doing research and engineering, and then we get approval, coverage, coding, and payment. We get onto the market. Most of these devices are time limited because someone else comes up with a new and improved version of this. And so here's what the net present value looks like over time as someone sitting down and making a portfolio decision whether or not to invest in new technology. All this relates back to the net present value. Is this a positive investment? Are we going to make money off this or not? And that's really dependent on the discount rate. And it's dependent on the actual flows of money, but it's also the discount rate. What's the clinical risk? What's the risk that this technology may or may not perform? Is this early stage or late stage? What's the business risk? You know, can we bring the team together? Can we actually execute about bringing this novel technology to market? And then I think what we have to recognize is this reimbursement risk. You know, this includes the risk of time and the risk of whether or not we're going to make it through the process. And the thing about a discount rate and why this is so important is the discount rate is to the power of time in the calculations, in net present value calculations. So just with some simple analyses I did, at a 10% discount rate, a 1-year delay for some of these processes results in a 19% decrease in the net present value. And a 1-year delay at a 20% discount rate, which is kind of appropriate for really novel technology, say a venture-backed company, would lead to a 56% decrease in net present value. And so these are extraordinary changes in terms of an investment thesis about bringing novel technology to market. Next slide. So we've talked a lot about evidence and the importance of evidence and how to generate evidence. And I'm in total agreement with the importance of evidence. And we just had this amazing natural experiment in this country with bringing new technology out to 60, 70% of the population. And here's the technology we use to record the evidence, in terms of whether or not we saw long-term harms or benefits from vaccination. So we each got one of these little paper records, and then we're left stuck with this idea of what are the side effects of vaccine, how long does immunity last, and which subpopulations, can you mix vaccine manufacturers, what happens if I get COVID after vaccination, is that going to impact my immune response? We have these tremendous questions that we have, and the idea was we didn't think about generating evidence in real time. This actually could have all been electronic. Imagine you got an email 2 weeks or a month or 2 months after you get your vaccination. How are you doing? The country would have had so much more evidence. So we're so lagging behind in terms of our concepts of how to use evidence and bring it forward. Next slide. Well, I want to just give 2 quick examples. One from Germany, where they actually have a different process, which is trust but verify. And their idea is you come to market and then you have a certain amount of time, to figure out whether or not your thing is actually performing the way they do. The interesting thing is actually a lot of the technologies that this is from 2017, but a lot of the technologies actually perform the way that manufacturers expected, at least in some subgroups. So it's not that we're not going to see any benefit at all in the Medicare population, but we're going to learn a lot more about which people are most likely to benefit. And then finally, some work we next slide, just completed on the most frequent surgical procedure in Medicare, on cataract surgery. We looked at cataract surgery in India and Nepal, and you see this tremendous innovation there, bringing access to a large number of people, bringing down the cost of technology. And it was all through innovation in surgical procedure, innovation in surgical design, innovation in surgical processes. And so I think this idea that, innovation is critical to actually achieving the clinical benefits, economic benefits, and that's an opportunity for all of us to consider as we're going through this process. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And our next panel, as soon as we get to it, is going to have a lot more to say about what can be done to improve the efficiency of evidence development and electronic systems. I know we're tight on time, but very important issues discussed. I'm trying to get in just a couple of questions. And this first one, I'm going to go back to Parshar and Dirksen. You all worked together, as I understand it, on that pretty detailed proposal that Parshar laid out on how to address the range of concerns that have come up with the current process and previous proposals to address it and move forward. And I think, as you pointed out, this seems to cover a lot of the points that Lee mentioned. It's consistent with the, at least at a high level, with the approach that Duke-Margolis has laid out. Do you all see any real challenges or remaining key issues in getting this sorted out? Like, how do we move forward from where we are now to a feasible path to implementation of a model that kind of puts all these concerns together? Because it seems like we're not that far off. And Prashar, if I just put I think this is what you were saying about you're not aiming for having an NCD process after all of this. You're aiming for, through this process, to avoid the need for an NCD process on the tail end, because there will have been worked out either the evidence and safety questions in advance, or a clear mechanism for doing so going forward. Is that right? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. It's actually slightly reversed. When we started this pathway, right, the thought was this is going to be transitional coverage. You're collecting the evidence. Hopefully it'll bear fruit in terms of what you want. It'll prove to be effective and good for Medicare patients. At which point you have enough data, presumably, to seek NCD. And what I was pointing out is that actually Dr. Fleischer's Lee's slides actually seem to imply that you could have evidence generation, during which time coverage would take place, and that would be the NCD itself. I'm not sure I interpreted that correctly. If that's the case, that would be great, not to have to do a two-step dance. But frankly, these are the types of legal/regulatory issues that need to be worked out. I think you referenced that as well in terms of statutory framework. So we need to work it out. From our perspective, we think CMS can do this without a change in statute. Let's just put it that way, if that helps. And then there's the resource issues, which other folks have talked about.
But it's
Dirk, anything you'd like to add? Does it seem like we're getting there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I believe it's eminently doable. I believe that, what we're hearing a lot of commonality here in this discussion about early engagement, about the necessity of evidence, about patient protections, and those are the principles that you start with. And as Parashar said at the beginning, these are ideas. I mean, we think there are ideas to build on here, but if we have other ideas, but it's eminently doable. I think we absolutely can get it done.
And back to Josh, going back to the survey, that put together a lot of issues that were adding up to some real concerns among many in industry, including in many aspects of breakthrough technologies that may not have, say, a coverage issue in particular. Do you have a sense of what the breakdown of those is? Are there examples of technologies that could help as we move forward with trying to put a framework in place, building off the ideas that we've talked about today, to just kind of kick the tires a little bit and make sure it would really work on those problems?
Sure. I mean, clearly this is most beneficial for technologies and new procedures that don't yet have a coding, coverage, and payment pathway already established that's acceptable. So there are a large number of innovations that fit that categorization that could be good candidates. Now, as you point out, I think you mentioned, there's a small number of those, and in the big picture, that's because these are so difficult to advance through to clinical testing and approval. So this isn't going to be, hundreds upon hundreds of technologies, but certainly a good benchmark is does an existing device or technology have an acceptable coding, coverage, and payment pathway? And if it doesn't, that probably means it's innovative and outside the norm of the existing framework, thus potentially deserving of especially if it's these other categorizations per the breakthrough process, life-saving, a major improvement in the standard of care. Those types of criteria, plus whether it has coverage, could be really a good way of identifying a good candidate for the program.
And in terms of filling the evidence gaps, I get your point that, well, if FDA has approved a pivotal trial, that's some very important evidence. But, many of these technologies, and this has come up in the comments, involve things like implants that are going to be around for years. And with the breakthrough approvals, they happen fast by definition. So that might just be, say, 6 months of trial data. And if those trials aren't formulated in a way that leads to longer term follow-up, there are some questions, at least in this process that we've seen over the past year, that may be hard to answer just using observational approaches. Similarly, if pivotal trials for 150 or 200 patients, even if 50 or 75 of them are Medicare beneficiaries, maybe they're Medicare beneficiaries in academic medical centers with a lot of experience. Are there some ways to characterize the evidence gaps and whether observational versus other studies versus maybe more advanced planning with the companies could help address? It just seems like, as Dr. Fleischer asked us to do, if we could break down this concern, this broad range of concerns about evidence into more clear categories, would be helpful for defining how this program can be most valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's, certainly I think as innovators, work very closely with the FDA on these parameters and understand that their goal is to provide, through the studies that they are requesting, a reasonable assurance of safety and efficacy. So with respect to any long-term complications or issues, the idea is that a lot of those should be addressed in the pivotal study. Granted,
but the pivotal study is not going to have the long-term results at the time of approval. It would have to be, at least the follow-up would have to be continued. And my understanding is that that's not always the way they're designed.
Well, I think it does actually, they adjust the length of these trials based on the risk and reasonable assessment. So there are very few highly risky implants that do not have an associated timeframe for a study that wouldn't be relevant for the assurance of safety and efficacy. That's part of the negotiation that goes on with FDA. That's not to say that there aren't late things that occur, and I certainly acknowledge that. And that's what the value of establishing a really robust real world evidence tracking, and whether it's through registry data or whatever methodology is chosen in the post-market study, that's a great opportunity for continuing to evaluate safety in a much broader population, especially in a Medicare population, which may not have had as much access during the trial. So absolutely, it is a great opportunity. And the fact that it is the opportunity by TCET to have it covered and paid for, thus facilitating, a true engagement and enough of a data set to be generated in a relatively short amount of time after approval, is a great opportunity, rather than the existing process, which obviously takes many years until you get to that state. And then, at that point, through multiple LCDs or what have you, you're finally able to get access to the population and develop that sort of evidence. So this could provide that great foundation of clinical evidence that would allow us to make good clinical decisions as we're trying to figure out what to do for our patients.
That's okay. Great discussion. We do need to move on to the next panel. Kevin, I appreciate your comment in the chat about a trial completion requirement for continued reimbursement might have more teeth than FDA post-market requirements, which haven't always been followed through. But clearly, a lot of progress in what needs to be done, how to do it, but maybe some more details to fill in, which hopefully we can do going forward on what kinds of additional evidence and what circumstances, when exactly would different features of this kind of approach apply. And with that, I'd like to turn to Marianne Hamilton Lopez. And Marianne, I know you've got just a little bit of time, but a panel with some really good ideas about how to practically implement better evidence systems and other supports for making transitional coverage work in practice.
Thank you so much, Mark. As mentioned, I'm Marianne Hamilton Lopez, the Senior Research Director at Duke-Margolis, and I oversee our policy research focused on biomedical innovation. And during this panel, we are going to be going over this, some of the key implementation considerations for a new transitional coverage pathway. Next slide, please. So we will try to breeze through, but want to make the big point that implementation is really an important component. And as mentioned in the many comments in today's webinar, there's so many of you that are trying to think through, how do we use real world data? How do we engage other partners? What else can we be thinking about beyond the coverage pathway? So the proposed pathways here, they really emphasize steps to improve, a timely and predictable process. But beyond coverage, there are other key processes that will support timely patient access that we want to touch on a bit, including reimbursement, post-market data collection, and real-world evidence generation, as was just mentioned, and then stakeholder engagement and alignment to support the above activities. So as mentioned earlier, it's important to recognize that while coverage is a key determinant for patient access, reimbursement largely determines the extent to which providers will have the financial access to adopt breakthrough devices. And an expedited coverage pathway should facilitate a pathway to coding and payment. Part of the struggle is that truly novel technologies are not likely to fall nicely into existing coding or payment structures. We've talked a bit about that. But for new codes and payments to be issued, there's a very complex process of defining the new technology across different coding systems, not all of which are even managed out of CMS. CMS has addressed coding application cycles recently, as well as streamlined NTAP and other pass-through processes for breakthrough devices that fall in existing reimbursement structures. However, for truly breakthrough devices, those that we expect would need to rely on something like TCET, there wouldn't be any codes to support incremental payments. Physician codes established through the AMA, if designated as emerging technology codes, can be a barrier to financial access for providers. Those codes, for example, are not managed through CMS. It is important to note that TCET is not the end be all for patient access. It is certainly a pathway that can facilitate coordination of all of the activities needed. As it relates to coding, there's a need for foundational guidance for developers and innovators on all the different pathways to coding and payment, such that they can incorporate it into their market access planning. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, and as we saw evident in the comments and questions in today's chat, we really want to focus on what is the post-market data collection and real-world evidence. The expedited approval pathways are built on the premise that there will be more evidence developed in the post-market phase. Cures 1.0 specifically highlighted the role of post-market information, and there is a guidance from FDA in the context of balancing pre- and post-market data. But there's a scope to reduce pre-market data on effectiveness through the reliance on post-market controls. However, as we now know, many FDA post-market authorization studies are not always completed in a timely fashion. So there's a need to sufficiently and effectively collect evidence following FDA approval to demonstrate the value and clinical utility of breakthrough devices. As we discussed earlier, coverage or reimbursement alone will not be sufficient to patient access, and neither patients nor providers will be motivated to adopt a new technology unless there is substantive evidence supporting improved health outcomes and treatment benefits. In a value-based payment environment, saw some questions about this, coverage and reimbursement will not be sufficient to ensure market access for high-cost devices with limited clinical evidence. So current challenges with post-market evidence generation include provider resources and administrative burden, capacity and quality to reliably collect patient-reported outcomes, in the absence of a unique device identifier, how to identify reliably when a breakthrough device is used for early post-market studies, safety surveillance, and other purposes. As we engage in these coverage discussions, there's an opportunity to consider if we can leverage pre-market evidence generation to incorporate real-world evidence. Is there a way to design hybrid pre-market studies that can be continued as post-market studies, thereby taking advantage of existing investments in data collection infrastructure? This would also provide for a longer follow-up data, which can only help in establishing the value of these new technologies. So this is a lot for us to try to cover in our last few minutes here, but we have an excellent group of panelists that have joined us, and to kickstart our conversation and to bring a bit more context to some of these issues that have just outlined. We have 3 experienced panelists who will be giving a few minutes of prepared thoughts. Afterwards, we will be having a discussion, and if time allowed, as throughout, we please encourage you to submit your audience for the panelists, for us, and we will answer as much as we can during our allotted time. Our first speaker is Louise Guy. Louise is a registered nurse with extensive experience in healthcare delivery systems for the past 15 years. She has directed her efforts toward the areas of reimbursement, medical policy, pricing, government relations, and managed care sales. Prior to Argenta, she was in the biotechnology industry and did medical review and utilization management at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts. Louise, can I turn it over to you?
As soon as I remember to unmute, we're good. Thank you for the introduction. So today, and you can put up that first slide. So today I'm going to use as an example a technology that I actually consulted for in the structural heart arena. Next slide. And I'm going to say that there are significant challenges, and I know that for certain because I lived through them. They were pretty intense. So, what are the concerns regarding fast track coverage? Is the technology safe, and can the technology be efficacious outside of the clinical trial? If a manufacturer who's received the breakthrough designation has 4 years to provide published peer-reviewed clinical outcomes in support of safety and efficacy, can they and will they be able to do it? Perhaps we could look at an example with when a pharmaceutical receives FDA registration approval with conditions. The conditions generally require a manufacturer to complete post-marketing studies that further support the outcomes that further related to the approved indication for use. How many manufacturers actually comply with the stipulation, and how often have you seen a drug receive approval with conditions that may not have fully complied with the conditions and actually get pulled off the market by FDA? Will the same thing happen in this pathway for approved breakthrough devices? Is this a concern, and should it be a concern? I want to talk about 3 barriers that present themselves with the potential for breakthrough. The first one is coding. What if appropriate coding does not currently exist to allow the provider and the facilities to report and bill for the technology and/or the procedure? Should AMA CPT be involved in this pathway or in this process? What if the payment level, and in this instance, this structural heart technology initially was an inpatient procedure only? So what if the level of the DRG is inadequate and the cover and doesn't even cover the acquisition cost of the device? In my experience, there was no transparency in the assignment of the payment process. And should the manufacturer have a say or be able to discuss the payment assignment? Does CMS have to ensure that the payment level is adequate to support the list price of a breakthrough technology? And lastly, how will hospitals and other facilities be able to de-risk their adoption of a technology that knowing is FDA approved and/or cleared, but that real world experience doesn't exist? So how does a manufacturer prepare to talk to a VAC committee? Because as an inpatient procedure, hospitals look to the VAC committee in order to be able to take on a new technology. So, it seems like getting everyone to the table, and meaning CMS, manufacturer, FDA, someone from AMA CPT, and maybe even an early adopter, might be productive so that all can agree on how to move forward and to form a pathway. Given all that has to be aligned in order to ensure there is no gap and access for patients or go dark period for providers post FDA approval, maybe CMS has to start the process to begin the process to begin with when the technology is still going through FDA approval. There's lots to be considered, and having in coverage is great, but is it enough? I'm
Good
done.
questions. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right. Well, our second speaker, and thank you so much, Louise. Our second speaker is Dr. Michael Mack, who has practiced cardiothoracic surgery in Dallas, Texas since 1982, and he's currently the director of the cardiovascular service line for the Bayer Scott and White Health, chair of the Bayer Scott and White Cardiovascular Governance Council. Oh my goodness, it's going to take all time to read all this, Dr. Mack. President of all sorts of wonderful things.
You can skip it,
He's gonna
Mary
go
Ann.
right into it. I'd love your comments.
All right, thanks. So I realize that just like CMS is resource constrained, that we are time constrained here. So I will truncate my remarks, and I will partner with Dirksen in sparing everybody by death by PowerPoint here. So by way of background, I've participated in a number of early feasibility and first in human trials in the United States, which is a benefit of the FDA's early feasibility programs. And now that the regulatory process has been facilitated, the obstacles we face now are clearly reimbursement, as we've heard. I'm also participating in a number of IDE trials of breakthrough devices. And again, we have a very clear pathway as to what's necessary for regulatory approval, but what's necessary for reimbursement is not clear at all. Also relevant to the discussion today, I'm in the leadership of the Heart Valve Collaboratory, which is a multi-stakeholder consortium with FDA, CMS, and NIH. As well as medical device sponsors to identify evidence gaps and mechanisms to address those gaps. And I was also in the original founder group of the STS ACC TVT registry, which was formed to inform CMS of coverage with evidence development for both TAVR and TEER, as well as post-market device surveillance. So with that background, you know, what I would say the key elements to an expedited pathway forward is, to me, this is like a racetrack. And any racetrack, you need guardrails in place. Breakthrough devices are going to, by definition, have less evidence on the front end and need more evidence on the back end. And as others have mentioned, this is going to require upstream engagement by CMS with the device sponsor early in the IDE process so that there is some certainty as to what the evidence that will be generated by the FDA approval process, what evidence gaps remain, and how best to address those evidence gaps. I can use the example of the TVT registry that was used for the NCD for TAVR, as well as 2 NCDs for TEER. The TVT registry over the last 10 years has now captured outcomes on over 400,000 patients receiving TAVR. Everybody that's not in a governmental hospital, 780 hospitals in the United States. And I think we have reached certitude that the pivotal trials are generalizable to the Medicare population as a whole. Similarly, there's now over 60,000 patients that have been gathered for TEER. Now, this has been very burdensome, but we've learned a lot. We've recently gone through a lean, parsimonious case report form to make the burden less on providers and clinical sites. And we are working on integrating these data registries now with EHRs to auto-populate these registries that could help. We are also involved with tricuspid valve devices, some of which anticipate approval in 2023, and we're partnering with Duke-Margolis on workshops as to how we can develop the patient-reported outcomes that are going to be necessary, not only for safety and efficacy, but for reasonable and effectiveness. The last comment I would make is that CMS has been great to deal with, just like FDA has, but not nearly as accessible. They are resource constrained. They need more medical officers. They need to clone Steve Farmer and his colleagues to be able to address this, because the workload is only going to increase with breakthrough devices. So the professional societies and the Heart Valve Collaboratory can help here. They can help provide subject matter experts, help populate panels to advise CMS as to the level of evidence, what evidence needs to be generated, and is the evidence sufficient? So I'll stop there, Marianne.
Thank you so much. And our final and certainly not least speaker is Joe Franklin, who we're pleased to have with us, a product counsel at Verily Life Sciences, and has held a number of positions and previously at FDA and including as a senior advisor on data and evidence initiatives. Joe?
Thanks, Marianne. Next slide. I'll very briefly go through a little bit about what it means to generate all of the evidence. You heard about this a little bit from Michael in the last session, in the last few minutes, but what it means to generate all the evidence that we're talking about. And what I think is very interesting, this will be very brief, obviously, but what I think is very interesting is to think about at the conclusion of this 2-hour webinar, what it means to generate evidence specifically for the CMS context. And it's really commendable for CMS to be so actively discussing what this means with the community. Next slide. So if you think that this is just a few pictures to leave you with today, if we think about the paradigm of evidence generation for medical products, you may have a slowly accumulating amounts of evidence based on patient experience from larger and larger studies. But after approval, there's a huge void, an opportunity that's lost to collect data from patients who are receiving the approved product after approval. And right now, other than limited post-approval studies, we lose the opportunity to benefit from that data and generate evidence. Next slide. So the goal, obviously, that we all have, and many of us have been working on this, is to capture that information and make it into useful evidence. Next slide. The critical point that has come up in a variety of ways in the conversation today is that the clinical trial, the pivotal trial for one of the breakthrough technologies that we're discussing on the call today, only captures a short portion of the overall experience of the patient. It doesn't necessarily capture information about the patient's health history before the clinical trial, and it doesn't necessarily capture information about the longitudinal, long-term safety and effectiveness of the product. But that clinical trial does provide an extraordinarily powerful way to understand whether the intervention works, and that's because of the randomization and prospective design of the study. Next slide. So the goal, I think, that we have, and many of us evidence generation geeks have, is to think about how to look at evidence generation holistically, understand how we can take advantage of a number of data sources and put them together with the data that we're so used to looking at from large prospectively designed randomized controlled trials, and solve this data void problem and solve the problem of generating evidence efficiently, including evidence efficiently over time for the product after approval. And that involves combining numerous data sources and is challenging. But I think that the conversation around TCET, and one of the important things to recognize in this call is that the conversation around TCET happens at a very important time in the evolution of our understanding of evidence generation. And I think it's important to think about how we can use these data sources to solve specifically problems that Medicare has in deciding whether to provide coverage to a product, including what we heard about from Dr. Fleischer, setting of care, and beneficiary needs. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Marianne. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate all of you. We had a number of different questions for a very lively and robust discussion that we were going to have, but due to time constraints, I thank you for all making the very important point that is going to take numerous stakeholders, the clinicians, the data generators, and along with and in alignment with CMS and the manufacturers and others to make sure that kind of these novel devices are really something that become accessible and that have the evidence long beyond the clinical studies. So thank you again for this group, and I'm going to turn it over to Mark and Josh to close us out.
Hey, Marianne, thanks to you and your panel for a great discussion. There is more work to do, but thanks to the work of everyone here today during this panel and previous to it, it does seem like there's getting to be more consensus on what the challenges are that need to be addressed in transitional coverage and a more specific and focused approach to getting there. So some convergence emerging. I do want to highlight, and it's in the chat, the upcoming CMS public meeting to hear comments from stakeholders about the transitional coverage pathway. Please try to get specific around the evidence questions, the solution that's relevant to the problem. So this can be as focused and efficient and impactful as possible. Lee, Dr. Fleischer, I don't know if you're still with us. Any final comments that you'd like to make?
Can you hear me, Mark?
Yeah, just fine.
Yeah, great. No, thank you so much. And you know, we are committed to getting innovative technologies to our beneficiaries, and really to say the adoptions of these items and services is not just about coverage, but it's really about convincing patients and their clinicians, as someone who is a clinician still, that and you know, it's not just about Medicare fee for service, but one of the key questions to us is thinking about how do we make sure the studies used to clear a device do demonstrate some evidence of benefit and assessment of harms, that we can get to a decision earlier. I do want to make one comment though, and importantly, CAG, our coverage group in CMS, does not use costs in the assessment.
Right.
And so therefore cost effectiveness is not the bar that we use. It's really about, is there a benefit to the beneficiary? And finally, as you said, Mark, we're really interested in hearing everyone with really specifics. Now that we've shown you, some general thoughts we have based upon your comments, let's get really specific over the next several months so we can make that end of the year proposed new regulation as we suggested.
Lee,
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks
Josh.
again for all your engagement and all you're doing. With respect to our work, we're obviously going to continue to stay in this space, so stay tuned. We'll get to more of those questions and filling in more of those details, I hope, soon. Special thanks to the teams at Duke-Margolis, Bina, Becky, others, and the team at Stanford Biodesign, Sandra, Heidi, the whole team. And Josh, thank you as well, and over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Mark. It's been a pleasure to partner with you and your amazing team on this. Again, I want to thank Dr. Fleischer. We also look forward to working with you on identifying the right future path for this for all the stakeholders' benefit. And special thanks to all that participated in the webinar, asking questions and just being present today. I think it highlights how important this is for the innovation ecosystem, inclusive of payers and providers, and most importantly, patients. So thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to future engagements with you. Have a good afternoon.